So, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming here today. Welcome to the fifth meeting of our lecture series, Challenges of Pluralism. We'd like to begin by thanking our two speakers, Harry BRIGHOUSE and Victoria Costa, and our panel chair, Victor MUNIZ-FRATICELLI, for joining us here at the University of Montreal. We're also very grateful to our partners and all those who've made this project possible. Thank you for your support. The topic of our discussion today is civic education in a pluralistic context. Those who have been here last time will remember that we talked about the relationship between political integration on the one hand and pluralism in our societies on the other hand, and looking at political answers to arising challenges in the context of growing pluralism. And so today we'll extend this debate by reflecting on civic education as a specific way to deal with these challenges and by discussing its potentials and limits in pluralistic societies. So as historical and contemporary examples show, civic education has traditionally been an important state tool to resolve problems of mistrust or low political interest from citizens and more generally to address political integration challenges. Depending on the comprehension of the citizen and the underlying theoretical conception, it may be used to form responsible and active citizens, to foster political participation, or even to create a sense of belonging and to strengthen communication. From a philosophical perspective, however, it's crucial to reflect on how far civic education can and should go, and thus on its potential and its limits. This is particularly true in contemporary democratic and pluralistic societies. Civic education has the potential to transmit a certain knowledge that facilitates integration in a pluralistic context. But likewise, there may be, depending on its curriculum and its pursued goals, certain risks ranging from illegitimate indoctrination to homogenization and assimilation. Therefore, what's the relationship between civic education on the one hand and a situation of cultural, moral, and religious diversity on the other hand? How does such a context shape civic education project with regard to its content, for example? And if designed in an appropriate way, what can be the role of civic education in realizing a just society? Given the growing pluralism in our contemporary democracies, discussing these issues is becoming more of a priority. We have to think about how a civic education program must be characterized to meet its integration potential while working within its limitation, which requires reflecting on a number of questions related to its curriculum, its goals, and conditions of its legitimacy. We have two talks today. In the first presentation, Harry BRIGHOUSE will address the question of faith schools. Are they able to contribute to promoting competent citizenship, and can they be supported by the state? And following that, the second presentation will look at the relationship between cosmopolitanism and civic education. Victoria Costa will explain why cultivating cosmopolitan virtue through civic education is of primary importance in contemporary democratic and pluralistic societies.
So these are the issues that we will discuss with our two panelists and also with our discussant, Victor MUNIZ-FRATICELLI, who is professor of law and political science at McGill University, and that we will briefly introduce you here. In few words, his main research interests are firstly the question related to pluralism on legal, political and meta-ethical dimensions. Secondly, the jurisprudence and legal theory, and especially constitutional and private law theories. He's also interested in the historical developments of liberal political theory, and finally, the theories of justice, and especially the work of John Rawls and the intergenerational justice. Among his numerous publications, we can mention What Justice Entails, published in 2011 in Les Ateliers de l'Éthique. Also, An Ephemeral Monstrosity, Administrative Despotism in the Risk Society, in a collection on law in the time of risk. And more recently, in 2014, The Structure of Pluralism at the Oxford University Press. Thank you again to all of you for accepting our invitation. We give the floor now to Mr. MUNIZ-FRATICELLI, and we wish you all a good lecture. Thank you.
this on? Oh, it is on. Good. Bon, avant tout, je veux remercier les organisateurs, Daniela HEIMPEL et Saaz et le département de sciences politiques de l'Université de Montréal. C'est vraiment vivre le pluralisme qu'il y a cette collaboration entre les universités anglophones et francophones dans cette ville qui est un endroit particulièrement intéressant pour l'étude de la philosophie politique et de l'éducation comme sujet de la philosophie et de la politique. I would first like to introduce Harry BRIGHOUSE, who will give the first presentation today, the first panel presentation on the topic that was just mentioned. Harry BRIGHOUSE is a professor of philosophy and affiliate professor of educational policy studies at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is director of the Center for Ethics and Education. He teaches applied ethics, political philosophy, and philosophy of education, has been a Carnegie Scholar and a senior program advisor for the Spencer Foundation. He's written or edited several books, including School Choice and Social Justice, On Education, Family Values, The Ethics of Parent-Child Relationships, and the Aims of Higher Education. He will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will cede the floor to Victoria Costa. Victoria Costa received her PhD in philosophy from the National University of La Plata in Argentina in 2003. She's currently associate professor at the Department of Philosophy at the College of William and Mary. She's the author of Rawls, Citizenship and Education from Routledge Press. She has also published articles on political philosophy, ethics, and education, which appeared in journals such as Politics, Philosophy and Economics, Theory and Research in Education, Hypatia, Journal of Applied Philosophy, Res Publica, among others. She's also the recipient of a number of fellowships and research prizes, and was co-editor of the journal Social Theory and Practice. Without further ado, I cede the floor to Harry BRIGHOUSE.
Should I go up there?
Sure.
I have this?
That's for the PowerPoint.
No.
Yes.
So should I? Oh, wow. Well done. Okay. Now I don't have to move. Good. So I'm going to talk about faith schools. And what I'm more interested in faith schools than I am in civic education for this purpose. That is, I want your focus to be on... I'm going to talk about civic education, but I want your focus to be on thinking about faith schools and religious schools, and I'll sort of say something about them in a moment, substantive about them. What I want to start, though, is... I'm really impressed with this. Sorry, I'm excited about having a clicker. So just very simple definition of faith school, and this is not supposed to be a sort of philosopher's definition. This is not necessary and sufficient conditions. But I think of a faith school, there may be other schools that are faith schools too, or religious schools, but at least schools that explicitly, whether in their mission or in their teaching practices, and I include in teaching practices the ethos of the school, which includes, the kinds of things that happen outside of class, but also the kinds of iconography in the school, promotes practices, beliefs, and traditions that are associated closely with a particular religious community. So in England, we have some multi-faith schools, which of course don't quite do this, but I would count them as faith schools too. That's why I don't want you to think this is a philosopher's definition. So that's my title is Faith Schools, Competent Citizenship in the State. I've defined faith schools more or less. I'm not going to define the state. You can imagine what you like about the state. But now let's just say a word about competent citizenship. So I think of competent citizenship in a democratic society. So I don't think the kinds of things that you need for competent citizenship in, say, Nazi Germany are necessarily the same. So, for example, a disposition to obey the law, which I think is an important part of competent citizenship in a democratic society, I think at least for some people in Nazi Germany would have been a pretty bad trait to have. I mean, the disposition to obey the law when you can't get away with disobeying it would be the trait that you'd want there. But you'd want people to know how to get away with disobeying it. But in our kind of society, the ability and disposition to obey the law. The second, and I think that's pretty uncontroversial, the second component of it is the ability and disposition to pursue, I think of it as I don't think of the ability and disposition to pursue your own self-interest as an important part of citizenship for a lot of people. For some people it is, in particular people who are victims of injustice or who are disadvantaged in some way. They should be pressing their own interests, but not because it's their own interests, but because it's entirely legitimate that those interests be pursued. Advantaged people should be pressing the interests of the disadvantaged as well. So the ability to pursue justice and those of one's interests that it's legitimate to pursue through legal means, the disposition to do it through legal means. And in both cases, I don't mean that people who are good citizens never break the law. They do, right? But they're inclined to do things legally. They're inclined to do things through political process when there are really serious injustices, which there are in some democratic societies, in most democratic societies, and you have good reason to be convinced that it's really, they're such serious injustices that it's worth breaking the law for them. One of the things you want children to learn is how to discern those situations, and to discern that those situations are not easily discerned by just thinking about what they want, right? But thinking hard about the moral questions involved. And then the disposition, and if you have the disposition, you definitely need the ability to notice those opportunities that you will have for breaking the law where it's right to break the law and it will have some valuable effect, or it might have some valuable effect. So the third component of citizenship for the purpose that I'm thinking of is really the one that I want you to... we're not going to talk much about legality, but the one that I think religious schools and faith schools have the most difficulty with, the one that people who want to condemn them on citizenship grounds are going to give them the hardest time about, is the ability and disposition to justify one's political actions in terms of values that the people against whom you're exercising political power in some way or in some sense share. Now, it might not be, again, I'm not a hardline public reason liberal here. I think that there are good reasons sometimes to just sort of do the best thing, even though other people don't recognize. But at least those should be not the standard case for most people, and most people should understand that, though it's not the standard case. The exercise of political power is the exercise of force over somebody else. When you vote, you're voting for the government, which has a monopoly on legitimate violence, to force other people to do things. And when you're forcing other people to do things, I'm all for forcing people to do things, don't get me wrong. I like that. But you have to have good reasons. And and ideally, you have reasons that those people can sort of at least understand, and ideally that they already share. I'm going to skip the next. Oh, no. I've already, this is already not in sync with my notes, so that's good. So, very simply, why is the state interested in promoting competent citizenship? You might think, well, why is this the business of the state? We can all sort of get along fine by, we can all just get along fine. Well, the state has an interest in promoting competent citizenship, primarily not because it benefits the people who have it, but because it benefits other people, right? We want other people... if you're really self-centered, your ideal sort of situation is that everybody else is a good citizen and you're not, right? Because then you can get away with loads of stuff and they'll all treat you nicely anyway. They'll do the kinds of things they ought to do to contribute to your well-being, and you won't have to do anything in return. That's only if you're very self-centered. the central purpose really in promoting citizenship, I think of, is not so that people can enjoy going around voting and, in America we have this thing like, go vote, do your, it's fantastic voting. No, it isn't. It's really boring voting. It's not something that makes people feel fulfilled. It's a dry, dreary activity. And I've spent a lot of time in political meetings. And, the first 3 are fun. But then it doesn't, then it's not for the fulfillment of the person themselves. Most education, I think the state should be promoting primarily because of the good of the people who are being educated. But in the case of good citizenship, it should be promoting that for the good of the people who are going to have to live around the people who are being educated, the people they're going to have to live with. That wouldn't matter. The state wouldn't have to necessarily do anything, I don't think, if we could rely on the market or on parental choices or whatever to supply high-quality citizenship, the characteristics that I've identified, without any state effort. The state could sort of stand in as a sort of guarantor of last resort, but it needn't be worrying much about it if we thought, well, that'll be produced anyway. I think there are lots of reasons to think, frankly, that even with state involvement, we're going to get an undersupply of good citizenship. And without the involvement of the state, we're going to get even more of an undersupply of good citizenship. And this isn't this applies to all schools. This is why I think you're always going to have it's always going to be hard to get a good supply. Turning people into good citizens is really hard and really costly. It's so hard that, frankly, I don't think we know really well how to do it. So teaching people if it were just a matter of teaching people always to obey the law, well, there are going to be lots of people who are going to break the law anyway, but you can teach people to obey the law, sort of blind obedience to the law. I don't think it's that difficult it's certainly not that difficult to get people to understand that's what they ought to do. But that's not what they ought to do. What they ought to do, a good citizen sometimes will break the law in service of the right kind of cause. So they have to have a kind of nuanced sensitivity to the sort of moral environment they're in. And that has to be taught. I don't think we know really well how to teach that. And I think it's very costly to teach that. That's one thing. But when you think about teaching people how to understand the political system they're in the US, I just tell you this, in the US, I just became a citizen, I got a passport. It's great. I have to have it with me because they won't let me back in without it now. So I live in horror of leaving with the wrong passport because they won't let me back in. But in the US, I now get to vote in 14 levels of election. Right? There are 14 levels of election for me to vote in, which I probably haven't counted them all, but they range, from president down through the Senate, the Congress, the governor, my friend the governor, 2 different houses of the Wisconsin legislature. Then we have a county board and we have a school board, which is separate from the county board, and a city council, and then we've got a whole bunch of different kinds of judges. I don't know what they do. And we elect policemen. I mean, we don't, not every policeman, but we elect the people who run the policemen, and then we elect the law. You wouldn't believe it, right? Now, learning how that system works and how to engage in that system and how to vote responsibly and thoughtfully in that system, that's a lot of work. I have a PhD and I spend my life thinking about political philosophy, and I'm really interested in complex systems. I don't get it, right? I think it's really, now it varies. In Britain, it used to be really simple. You just taught people that, they get to vote once every 4 or 5 years, and there were only 2 or 3 parties, and you could tell them pretty much what each party stood for, because they actually stood for different things in those days, and they were sort of identifiably. So it didn't take that much. It didn't take as much. That's learning the political system. That can be hard. The hardest thing of all is learning how to separate yourself enough from your prejudices received opinion, your fundamental moral commitments about how to live your own life, that when you call upon the government to do things in your name, when you vote, when you ask the government to exert power over other people, you don't simply do so on the basis of your prejudices, received opinion, your gut reactions, and your the morals by which you decide you want to live your life. That takes a lot of intellectual and emotional subtlety and complexity. Teaching that is, again, difficult. Doing it well is costly. And we can't rely on parents to do it. Why? And this is because of what I said before. So the point, the main purpose of trying to get people to be good citizens is so that it will benefit the people around them. That is not the central motive of parents when they're thinking about their children's education. It might be the central motive of some parents, sort of, I don't know, now I'm just going to be insulting. I sort of imagine hippie parents thinking like that. And of course there are ultra left-wing parents who think like that. And there are no doubt some, I'm sure the Queen, is she your Queen as well?
But it's a different crown.
Yeah, but still, why did you, well, I don't know what to think.
Yeah, I just became a citizen too. It's not my fault.
Anyway, so the Queen, I'm sure when she was educating Prince Charles, she wasn't thinking about his good. She was thinking, well, we care about the good of other people and he'd better be good at whatever he does because it matters for other people. So there are some people who are well-willed. But mostly, especially in a very competitive, individualistic, capitalist society, your central thought when you're trying to educate your kid is about what will benefit my kid. You're thinking about their well-being and you're thinking about their well-being without a lot of regard to the well-being of other people. Of course, you want them to be law-abiding, by and large, because people who are not law-abiding get screwed, right? But you're not thinking hard about, on the whole, you're not thinking hard about trying to get them to be really good citizens in the way that we should probably want. Okay. So what's the problem with faith schools? What does any of this have to do with religious schools? So I think that lots of people, certainly in my environment, certainly in the US, US liberal academics who think about these things, and maybe even more so the ones who don't think about these things, have a built-in sort of hostility to religious schools. Certainly the idea that the government, the idea which by the way, I'm going to endorse in a little while, but I haven't endorsed yet, that the government ought to be funding faith schools is total anathema to people. I think there are lots of reasons why people think this. They don't like religion, they don't trust the religious, they think it's bad for the children. But one of the reasons that I hear most often is because religious schools won't produce good citizens. And I think there are good reasons for thinking that religious schools have very, very special barriers to producing good citizens. Of course, there are lots of lovely religious schools. So, my daughter, the first school, you'll see a picture in a while, but the first school my daughter went to was a religious school. It was a Church of England school in England. And, it was lovely. Like, they had, they took trips to the mosque and they took trips to the synagogue and they taught the children about all sorts of things and they taught the children to be good kids and whatever. And, it's Church of England, so, nobody quite knows what they believe anyway. Certainly God, not certain. Stephen Fry, that thing with Stephen Fry last week, where you're all staring blankly at me. Everybody hasn't heard that Stephen Fry attacked God last week? Well, he did. But that wasn't the Church of England God. The Church of England God's this sort of fuzzy guy who knows exactly what's going on. But most religious schools, or at least many religious schools, sorry, I should just say many religious schools, they really do have sectarian goals. And I don't mean sectarian in a bad way. It sounds bad, doesn't it? I should think of a better term. They have sectarian goals in mind. They want to keep the kids in the religion. They want to promote the religion that the school is attached to. One of the things that they do is they promote faith. That is, they promote unreasoned belief. Now, if you're centrally involved in promoting unreasoned belief in something that is quite difficult to believe in a non-unreasoned way, right? Which most religions, most of the fundamental commitments of most religions are quite hard to believe if you really just subject them to rational scrutiny and don't do anything else. I think it's reasonable to think you're going to have a slightly hard time fostering the kinds of habits of mind and the kinds of emotional habits that are needed in order to step back from those commitments when you are engaged in political debate and political action. And in many, so the Church of England schools absolutely do not do this, and they have no purpose in doing this. But for example, again in the UK, I'm thinking the Roman Catholic schools, these are all state-funded schools. Roman Catholic schools particularly, of which there are a lot, are very committed to fostering and maintaining a faith identity, the identity of a community which is really a community of faith. They see themselves, and if you I've talked with leaders, people who run the Church of England schools and the Roman Catholic schools, it's really funny. You talk to the people who run the Church of England schools in Britain and they talk like, they talk, well, these are everybody's schools, that they're everybody's, so we have to think about, we're really a public service organization here, and we're trying to sort of fulfill this secular mission, and we're doing it because we're good. And you talk to the people who run the Roman Catholic schools, and they say our schools. They do not say the Roman Catholic schools are our schools, and we do not let non-Roman Catholics in them, and they're allowed not to. They have a very proprietorial sense, and that I'm sounding really critical. Look at the history of Roman Catholicism in Britain. You might not think that this was a totally unreasonable attitude to have. You'd certainly think it was a pretty understandable attitude to have, given the history of the relationship between Roman Catholicism and the state. Muslim schools in Britain and Muslim schools have sort of exercised in a way, I mean, I've got to be honest, until people started talking about funding Muslim schools, nobody really cared. As soon as people started talking about funding Muslim schools, all the anti-Christians came out of the woodwork. Richard Dawkins didn't say very much about church schools until Muslim schools were going to be funded. And lots of people who are perfectly happy with the status quo really came at it when we started funding Muslim schools in 1997. And lots of Muslim schools are, whether private or public in the UK, they are indeed very largely interested in maintaining a certain kind of faith identity and communal identity, one that is not simply, not simply the identity of, England supporting cricket lovers, right? I mean, that's one of the things that people get very excited about in England. Does the Muslim support England, or does he support Pakistan? Because if he supports Pakistan, he can't be properly English. Now, I just have to say, my dad brought me up to support India and Pakistan every time when they played England. So I wasn't brought up properly English either. And I'm not Muslim. Just, that might surprise you, but it's true. This is a very recent, anybody who watches Fox News will know that Birmingham is a no-go area for non-Muslims. You know this? Birmingham in Britain, which is our second largest city, you go to Birmingham, everybody's Muslim. It's just amazing. Like there's no, you never see anybody white, you never see any, and even the people who are, even the Afro-Caribbeans, they're all Muslim too. No, Fox News, oddly enough, got it wrong there. But what's true is that in Birmingham very recently there's been over the past year, there's been a big controversy about the so-called Trojan horse schools. And the Trojan horse schools are public schools, they're state-funded schools, which are, some of them are Muslim schools, some of them aren't even Muslim schools, where quite narrow sectarian groups of Muslims have deliberately and in an organized fashion taken over the governor's bodies of those schools. This is something that you could have predicted immediately, that the Conservative Party announced its plans to allow that to happen. You would think it would happen, so why the Conservative Party was so fussed about it when it happened, I don't know. But and the fuss really is, so part of the fuss is just straightforward xenophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment, but some of it is a worry about the kinds of identity formation that are going on in these schools and the kind of anti-integrationist identity formation that is going on and the collateral effects of that. So I do think that, at least in principle, knowing what we know about religious schools, knowing what we know about what good citizenship would be, we've got reasons to think that religious schools would have, on average, a problem when it came to promoting citizenship. So what should the state do? Okay, so what I want to run through is 4, I hope there are 4 on my slide, we'll see. 4 ways that the state might try and relate to religious schools, or go about relating to religious schools, the kind of thinking process you might have. So the first is, yeah, good, I've got them all there. The first is to prohibit them. Just make them illegal. So the state of Portland, not lots of people won't know this, but the state of Portland in the late 19 teens, just after World War I, passed a law prohibiting all private schools, the purpose of which was to prohibit Roman Catholic schools, basically, since they were all the private schools. Like, it was a pretty easy way of getting in. And it didn't last long because the U.S. Supreme Court found that you weren't allowed to do that. So actually in the U.S. this just isn't an option. You can't prohibit religious schools. Practically, politically, it's not really an option in most liberal democratic countries. And I think it's good that it's not an option. Not only is it impractical, but I think that for all sorts of reasons, which I might go into later, it's good that public schools, that is non-religious schools, have a certain kind of, live in a competitive environment. They live in an environment in which they have to respond to some kinds of market demand. I'm not a marketizer. I'm all for state schools. I'm not a big fan of private schools. I'm certainly not in favor of privatizing the ones that we already have in general. But I don't think market competition is a bad thing in this case. You can't do it, and I don't think you should even if you could. So instead, the second approach is the approach that the Americans take. America is quite unusual. Sorry, am I allowed to call it America here? You get annoyed? Right, it's just the USA sounds so annoying, and it sort of reminds you of the Bruce Springsteen song, and you just sort of think, oh God, you know. I mean, that bit of America anyway, the bit that I have my passport from. They take this approach which they call the separationist approach, and this is like, it's actually like this is treated like a religion among actually nearly everybody, including people who like religious schools. But you know, my colleagues, my students, they can't stand it when I say anything about how the Constitution might just be a little bit wrong about something sometime. And this is the separationist approach is what we have, a separation of church and state in the US. There is no established church. And through a bizarre set of case law decisions, we've ended up in a situation in which, in fact, the state can fund private schools, but if it funds private schools, it mustn't tell them anything about what they must do. So the Lemon Test, which has been in place since about 1971, it has been slightly revised, but this is still the basic story. Government actions which have that have no secular purpose, if forbids government actions that have no secular purpose, I don't have it on my, oh yeah, I do, or have a primary effect of advancing religion, or foster an excessive entanglement between government and religion. So you could fund religious schools if funding the religious schools had a secular purpose, except if it has a primary effect of advancing religion, you're not allowed to do it. So you have to fund religious schools for a secular purpose, but it mustn't have a primary effect of advancing religion, whatever primary effect means. And there mustn't be excessive entanglement between government and religion. So if you do fund private religious schools, and it doesn't have a primary effect of advancing religion, that's probably because you've got an excessive entanglement between government and religion, because you have told the schools that they have to abide by a national curriculum, or they're not allowed to proselytize, or they have to allow the Muslim kids not to attend prayer, or whatever it is, right? There are state-funded religious schools in the US, but there aren't many, and there won't be many. And this has been the approach that has been taken in the US, and it's the approach that's recommended by the kind of new atheist enthusiasts in the UK. Now that Muslim schools are on the table, people like Richard Dawkins, Anthony Grayling, the late lamented Chris Hitchens, say, no, we should be separationists like the good old Americans, right? Sorry, those Americans. I think the separationist approach is crazy, okay? I think it's crazy so most countries don't have an establishment clause, and a jolly good thing too, in my opinion. For the ones that don't, I would be completely against the country that I come from disestablishing the church. If it did disestablish the church, I would not want this whatever establishment clause was included to be interpreted in a completely bizarre way that the US interprets its. Case law is a total mess in the US. I'm going to skip the slide in which I show you what a mess case law is, but I tell you, it's a total mess. But the main thing is it sort of makes a fetish of religious schools. Like, if you've got some really good secular goal that could be advanced, are you really willing to just give up on that goal just in order not to promote religious schools? Just in order not to have any kind of effect of promoting religion? There's plenty of religion about. It's not like you're going to sort of suddenly have all these religious people when you used to have none. So I would reject that approach, the separationist approach. Now, so there's the third approach. I really hope I get to the fourth, because the fourth is the payoff. We'll see. I mean, I will stop in 5 minutes, I promise. But so the next approach that I want to, so I think the next approach is very tempting, and I want to explain why I think this is wrong. And I think it's the first one it's the one I used to take. So what you do is you think, okay, we've got these fundamental secular educational goals in the case we're thinking about promoting competent citizenship. And so then what we'll do is on a school-by-school basis, we'll say, well, is this school good at promoting it? If so, yeah, we'll fund it or we'll support it. If no, then we won't fund it, right? Now, on that approach, I want to just say a word about why I think if you did take that approach, religious schools would do a lot better than a lot of people think. The main reason is that when you're asking this question, will this school do well with respect to promoting competent citizenship, you should not be, as I think most of my colleagues do when they think this, compare the school you're looking at with some ideal school. You should be comparing your school with the actual schools that the kids would actually go to if they didn't go to this school, right? And I've got the pictures. So this is a picture from the first school my daughter went to. It's a stained glass window with religious iconography on it. My daughter went to a Church of England school when she started school, 2 years. And here's a picture from the second school she went to. This was posted at the eye height of a 6-year-old on the front door of the first secular school she went to in the US when she started school. Now, to you, it might look like just an innocent advertisement for sugar cereals, right? But it's much more than that. It's an icon of a way of life, the American way, commercialism, individualism, materialism. It's essentially, to me, a religious symbol. I don't mean that I fall down and pray at it when I see it. I actually bristle irritatedly, which I don't do when I see a cross. The actual school that she ended up going to had was no better at promoting citizenship than the one that she started at. I recommend this book by my colleagues Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy. How many minutes do I have? Because I'm pretty close to finishing.
I can give you 5 more.
Oh, that's nice of you. Okay. So what they do in this book is they look at the way that controversial issues are taught. It's a very large-scale empirical study. It's really neat. The way that controversial issues are taught in a range of schools in the Midwest. And among the schools they look at a number of secular public schools. They look at a number of Roman Catholic schools. They look at a number of Christian schools, and they look at Christian means not Roman Catholic, and in the US. And they look at a number of private schools that are not religious schools. And the standout chapter for me, what they did was they followed a number of teachers, they interview the students, they do surveys on the students, they did follow-up surveys with the students. And the standout chapter to me is about Mr. Walters. And Mr. Walters is an evangelical Christian, and he's teaching in an evangelical Christian school in which almost all the students are evangelical. And I just tell you, the truth is, another of the teachers in the book is really outstanding as well, and my daughter has been taught by that teacher. And he was great. But of all the teachers in the book I'd like my daughter taught by, my kids taught by, it's this one. Now, you won't think that if you look at this quote from him, because in this quote he says, "Me, I'm an evangelical Christian, and and God is what matters to me." But now look at the next school. Very conservative school, politically conservative. But now look at the next slide. I'm assuming you're unfortunate enough to know who Rush Limbaugh is. If you're not, I'm not going to tell you. You'd rather not know. And then you see the things that the kids say. I think I've thought more about stuff, including the Second Amendment. I used to be like, I can't do the accent, by the way. Oh, everyone should have guns. And now I've re-looked at that. I'm not so sure. But I kind of still would like that to happen. I don't know. What he's done, and if you read the descriptions of the lessons, you see him doing it. You see him introducing all sorts of doubt. You see him making them think, making them rethink their commitments, and making them detach from their commitments to understand that even if they maintain their commitments, maybe then it's not appropriate to use those commitments when they're trying to force other people to do things. Religious schools many religious schools will do a lot better than many secular schools on this school-based approach. Still, I think it's the wrong approach. So I'll very quickly tell you the right approach and then I'll stop. I think it's the wrong approach essentially because it neglects one thing, which is that when you go on a school-by-school basis, all you do is you look at the effects of the school on citizenship, whereas what you want to do is you want to promote citizenship, right? And what the school does and how the school behaves affects how the culture promotes citizenship. So let me just give you I'll just describe the Islamic school case in the UK. Why I'm such a fan of of funding Islamic schools in the UK. So I think on the whole, the schools that the British government has funded in the Islamic schools are not great promoters of citizenship. But what the funders have done, what the Department of Education did when it started funding them in 1997, is it went out and it found those schools where the leaders and the managers of the schools and the people around the schools, the communities that were running the schools, were broadly integrationist, where there were people who were going to be happy to abide by the national curriculum, where they wanted the status that government funding would give them. And crucially, they knew that many of those kids were already going to state-funded Islamic schools. Because Britain, like the rest of the US, I know that the King of Saudi Arabia just died, but Britain, like the rest of Europe, Britain has many state-funded Islamic schools. They're funded by the Saudi Arabian state, and they're funded by the Saudi Arabian state in order to promote the kinds of attitudes that result in Al-Qaeda, that result in ISIS, and they do it. They don't want those. They don't want those imams there in Saudi Arabia. They want them in Northern Europe. And if you know that that sort of thing's going to be going on, you will, I think, sensibly fund some schools that will draw away from those schools and will enhance the reputations and the standing of the communities that are running these more integrationist schools, even if you think that the schools that you're now running, that you're now funding, are not as good at promoting citizenship as some alternative schools would be. Because you take a holistic approach to the promotion of citizenship. You take a holistic institutional approach. That is, you understand schools are not the only institutions influencing the outcomes. You know that religious schools, whether they're funded or not, will influence how well the goals you care about are secured. And you know that schools affect one another, and decisions about whether to allow or to fund one school will affect the character of other schools. So you just take the stance toward funding that, when you take that stance over the whole system, is most likely to promote the citizenship goals you have throughout the society. I will show you one more picture just so you see. That is the first state-funded Islamic school in Britain. It's the first UK state-funded Islamic school in Britain. And there's the chair of its board of governors and a friend of his. This is the test. So who are they? Cat Stevens and Muhammad Ali. Yes. I'm done now.
Okay, so I'll try to talk, but I may end up reading because sometimes it's easier to have a clearer argument if I read. So I want to say something very briefly about the motivation for this paper. So a few years ago, I wrote a paper on cosmopolitan education, and my discussant in the conference was Simon Callan. And he challenged me when I finished the paper with the question, are we all cosmopolitans now? And so what it seemed to be the case in my description of cosmopolitanism, what I was saying didn't really help us distinguish between cosmopolitans and other liberal nationalists, liberal patriots, liberal culturalists. So part of what I think the problem is, and I've been thinking about it a lot, is whether we can really give an account of cosmopolitanism that explains why is it different from other alternative, which are reasonable proposals in political philosophy, but the account shouldn't be too narrow that only one author fits in that theory of cosmopolitan education. And the problem that I have is that there are quite different proposals in cosmopolitan education that have been defended under the label of cosmopolitan. I would like that the account I'm giving helps to unify at least a lot of them and explain what they have in common. And if possible, but that's just really expecting too much, I would like it to resonate or have some connection with the historical cosmopolitans, especially the ancient cosmopolitans. But that may be just really been too ambitious. So this is what I come up with in trying to solve all these puzzles. So my idea is that we could try to respond about the question, what is cosmopolitanism and what is cosmopolitan education, by focusing in an idea of cosmopolitan virtue. And so my proposal is to use the idea of the virtues following Philippa Foot's theory. And Foot thought that the virtues are correctives for common flaws in human beings. I will explain this a little bit. And so I want to argue that we could think of cosmopolitanism as a corrective virtue, and this would be a corrective for tendencies to form certain kinds of false beliefs about political entities, like countries, nations, and cultures. And I think there is a tendency to make false assessments about these entities, and we need to correct this, not just for epistemological reasons, because it's good to have an accurate picture of the world, but also primarily because having these wrong ideas may lead people to engage in unfair behavior and to support unfair and just policies. So then I would like to make the case that cultivating this kind of cosmopolitan virtue should be a central goal of civic education in democratic pluralistic societies. So cosmopolitanism has been the subject of debate for more than 2 decades, but it seems that it doesn't really refer to anything like a unified theoretical perspective. Some cosmopolitan views celebrate cultural diversity, others propose the development of global political institutions, others advocate something like good Samaritanism across borders, some kind of global humanitarianism. And in the face of this variation, the question is, can we try to unify all these accounts as responding to some kind of unified idea? And I would say, well, perhaps we can unify much of the cosmopolitan literature by focusing on the characteristic dispositions of people we will tend to call cosmopolitan. So cosmopolitanism can be regarded as a corrective virtue that is very valuable from a civic perspective. And if we think of cosmopolitanism as a virtue, this may explain why we have so many difficulties articulating a distinctive cosmopolitan thesis, because on a virtue-based view, cosmopolitanism is not a thesis at all. So people who possess cosmopolitan virtue will tend to make very different political assessments and recommendations depending on feasibility, foreseeable consequences, and other contextual matters. So it's not the case that if you're a cosmopolitan, you always have to support international institutions or things like that. You could be a cosmopolitan and think that in some cases it's better not to advance in some political projects. Now, about trying to unify the literature, there is one way of characterizing cosmopolitanism that has been enormously influential, and it does unify a variety of theories. And this account was proposed initially by Thomas Pogge. Pogge argues that all cosmopolitan positions endorse some form of moral universalism, so all cosmopolitans will be committed to the view that human beings are the ultimate units of moral concern, and their rights generate duties that apply to everyone. So cosmopolitanism will be the same as moral universalism. Now, the problem with this understanding of cosmopolitanism, and you can already anticipate by what I said before, is that it doesn't really help us identify what are the specific contributions of cosmopolitans to contemporary debates, because there are many liberal views that share these premises that Pogge identifies, but also give a central place in their theories to patriotic, nationalist, or culturalist concerns. And then if cosmopolitanism is just moral universalism, then we're almost all cosmopolitan now. Maybe it's a few people want to go another road, but almost everybody, nobody would deny the validity of basic human rights, for example. And that will include liberal nationalists, liberal patriots among us. So I don't think that strategy works because it's overly general. Now, a second strategy for dealing with this variety of cosmopolitan views, which also is influential in the literature, is to group them in subcategories. We have moral cosmopolitanism, political cosmopolitanism, juridical cosmopolitanism, cultural cosmopolitanism, and so on. And then we could try to characterize each subcategory in a more precise and useful term, and some people have done that. But still we have the question, why do all these different theories deserve to be regarded as species of cosmopolitanism? What do they have in common, given that they seem so different, all these theses? And maybe we should just give up and admit, well, all that links the variety of views is something like an overlapping network of family resemblances, and there isn't a single unifying property. So it could be the case that all these different views are the result of the alternative interpretations of the initial metaphor of being a citizen of the world. But perhaps we can unify many cosmopolitan theories if we look at this idea of cosmopolitan virtue. And the kind of virtue I'm thinking is a corrective disposition that combats certain mistaken and dangerous attitudes towards one's country, one's nation, and one's culture. And these attitudes need to be corrected because they may facilitate injustice, and they involve some characteristic epistemic failures. And that's the tendency to misrepresent the history and the practices of the political and cultural groups to which one belongs in ways that tend to oversimplify and distort the actual phenomena. So this idea that virtues are beneficial characteristics that function as correctives to common flaws in human beings was famously defended by Philippa Foot. She took the idea from Aristotle, but she gave it a precise, more precise lines. And so Foot says that virtues are traits that are beneficial either to the agent or to others, and they are beneficial because there are specific harmful human tendencies in thought, feeling, or action that need to be corrected. So for Foot, part of what we mean that when we call something a virtue is that it involves thinking, feeling, and acting well when it is typically difficult for human beings to do so. For example, I'm not going to start discussing virtue by virtue, but benevolence is a virtue because human beings typically find it difficult to care about the needs of others as much as their own or those of family and close friends. And in contrast, the benevolent person, someone who has this cultivated disposition, is reliably motivated to act in ways that benefit others. And this could be either because she experiences more sympathy than other people, or perhaps because her moral views motivate her to act in beneficent ways. So we could have different explanations for why some people tend to have these correctives. And the same goes for other virtues, like courage is a virtue because human beings tend to experience fear, which sometimes gets in the way on our responding properly in dangerous situations. So courage is a corrective to this common error. And from Foot's account, there are 2 points that I think are interesting. She points out that it is not necessary that every particular person finds it difficult to respond in a virtuous way, because the reference class is human beings in general. They correct common flaws in human beings. It's not the case that for me to have the virtue first, I have to have the flaw. And then another thing that I think is interesting is that her account makes room for a variability in what will count as a virtue because human circumstances change over time, and traits that were counted as virtues in the past may, because they were beneficial, may cease to be beneficial. And it may be that in the future, some new traits that were not very beneficial may become crucial to human well-being because there are new dangers and new pervasive temptations. And a nice example, it's a virtue that Gambrel and Cafaro talk about. They call it simplicity. And this is a virtue that involves awareness and concern for the environmental consequences of policies and of individual actions. And it involves a disposition to resist excessive consumption. And this will be a new virtue which can help individuals to live more rewarding lives and prevent environmental degradation. And it's clear that this virtue is more important today than it was 200 years ago, because the consequences, the possibility of excessive consumption and environmental destruction today are more serious than it was 200 years ago. So we could expect the vocabulary of virtue slowly to change to reflect some changes in circumstances. And then if the vocabulary of virtue changes, then maybe that some beneficial correctives may not be already appreciated as virtues, even though they are. I do think that that simplicity is a virtue, but we don't have it. It's not an everyday language. In fact, it's a technical term. And perhaps something like that happens with cosmopolitan virtue. There are some personal, social, and political benefits that are generated by what I will call cosmopolitan dispositions that have more significance today because of an increasing interconnectedness of the world. But these benefits may not always be very easy to appreciate. That will explain the error. Why am I talking about a virtue that nobody else is calling a virtue? That's because it's not so obvious what the benefits are. So my idea is that cosmopolitan dispositions will correct a variety of beliefs and attitudes towards political entities that include a number of mythical stories that simplify and distort the relevant phenomena, and that often lead people to act wrongly towards those perceived as outsiders. I will briefly mention the cosmopolitan outlook towards cultural phenomena and towards countries to show that we could see them as the expression of similar corrective mechanisms. Although we may also think that the identification with a culture and the identification with a country are quite distinct, so that even if there are corrective mechanisms that can mitigate the bad effects of these identifications, this doesn't really show that they have a lot in common. But perhaps the stories we're often told about at school, in the media, and elsewhere about our country and our culture serve similar political purposes, and the kinds of identifications they are meant to produce work to reinforce each other, and they cannot be easily disentangled. So it's not surprising that those who have cosmopolitan attitudes towards their countries and nations often have corresponding attitudes towards cultural phenomena. And so I think it's best to regard the corrective of both sorts of tendencies as part of the same virtue. So the first thing would be to look quickly at cosmopolitanism as it appears in the context of attitudes towards culture. And for that, I'm going to use some of the ideas of Jeremy Waldron. So according to Jeremy Waldron, cosmopolitans are people who consciously endorse ways of living in the world that involve the appropriation of cultural materials from very heterogeneous sources without particular concerns for maintaining and reproducing the culture they inherited from their family and community. So for Waldron, a culture is a set of practices, customs, norms, institutions that are characteristic of a people, which are sometimes associated with a number of moral, religious values and metaphysical beliefs. But of course, then there are cultures that are internally very pluralistic, and so people can share a culture without sharing specific values or metaphysical beliefs too. But that depends on the size of the culture, how many people we're thinking about, and the group. So Waldron argues that those who try to maintain a traditional culture generally operate with a distorted view of these very cultures. So cultures are living phenomena, and cultural practices are always changing in response to new circumstances, incorporating new elements, modifying some and abandoning others. So people who care about preserving the culture of a community are likely to be tempted to block, in an artificial way, natural tendencies to change. So Waldron suggests that these attempts at cultural preservation are self-defeating because the preserved practices will tend to survive as pieces of a living museum and will not function in the same way as they would if they were unprotected. So some traditional practices were developed to respond to problems. If circumstances change and we keep the practices, they are not doing the same work that they were doing at the beginning. A related problem with cultural preservation is that it may require a certain amount of coercion, prohibiting and restricting certain options, redistributing resources to subsidize the practices that are considered representative of the culture. Now, I don't mean to say that we should condemn all attempts at cultural preservation without considering the grounds and the means that they employ. But nevertheless, they are in need of justification. So there is a temptation. I want to preserve this culture. I'm going to take all these steps. So in contrast to the traditionalist, Waldron's cosmopolitan understands the inevitability of cultural change and doesn't find it threatening. She's happy to participate in new cultural experiences and incorporate them in her life. And you have in the handout his quote, and I'm going to quote Waldron. So Waldron says, "The cosmopolitan may live all his life in one city and maintain the same citizenship throughout, but he refuses to think of himself as defined by his location or ancestry or citizenship or language. Though he may be living in San Francisco and be of Irish ancestry," I think he's talking about himself, "he does not take his identity to be compromised when he learns Spanish, eats Chinese, wears clothes made in Korea, listens to arias by Verdi, sung by Maori princesses on Japanese equipment, follows Ukrainian politics, and practices Buddhist meditation techniques. He's a creature of modernity, conscious of living in a mixed-up world and having a mixed-up self." And this is the end of the quote. Now, you may ask, well, what does it have to do with virtue at all? It's not immediately clear what precisely makes this person a cosmopolitan, or whether there is something particularly valuable about the attitudes and activities that are described in this passage. We don't need a great deal of wisdom or insight to become aware of global interconnectedness and the resulting cultural mix. It seems possible to engage in these activities he's mentioning in a thoughtless, consumeristic way that doesn't involve much knowledge or appreciation of cultural practices. So we can do this in a way that we could call it vicious, not because it's evil, but it's not very wise anyway. So what is it good about being cosmopolitan in this sense? My suggestion is that what constitutes part of cosmopolitan virtue is the capacity to appreciate a variety of cultural materials, to be genuinely interested in learning about them, without buying into myths about the nature of these cultural phenomena. The cosmopolitan refuses to think that characteristics such as the culture she has inherited, her citizenship, ancestors, or native language define who she really is or what is valuable for her to do. And she thinks the same is true of other people. In Waldron's view, many traditionalists take too seriously the stories about the distinctiveness of their cultural practices, and cosmopolitan attitudes may count as virtues when they work to correct mistaken views about what these political entities are like, as well as mistaken beliefs of people as very neatly defined by cultural, ethnic, or national affiliations. These attitudes may help them avoid preconceptions and pursue a life that best suits their interests. And perhaps it can help those who cultivate this virtue to respond to strangers in a more thoughtful and respectful ways by preventing the sort of attitudes that result from oversimplifying assessments of entire cultures. But of course, not all those who are concerned with maintaining core aspects of their cultural traditions have a distorted view of what they are doing or what the inherent difficulties of their enterprise. And nor do all traditionalists fail to be respectful of outsiders or of insiders who refuse to follow the traditional ways. So it's not unavoidable if we're a traditionalist that we're going to have these mistaken attitudes. Now, a second way of thinking about what cosmopolitans are like was proposed by Simon Keller. And Keller's account focuses on cosmopolitan attitudes towards her country, and is based on a contrast with patriotic attitudes. So I should mention that quite similar arguments could be constructed that apply to loyalty to one's nation, but for reasons of space, I will just focus on cosmopolitanism as an alternative to patriotism. But we could very easily make similar claims about nation. So Keller argues that cosmopolitans can be good citizens insofar as they do the things that we take to be required if one is to perform the role of citizen well. A good citizen is someone who follows the law, pays her taxes, participates in political life, and works to make the community where she lives more just. Notice that none of these activities requires a special patriotic attachment. Good citizens will comply with the law of other countries when they are abroad as well. And if they do not work to improve social institutions abroad, this may be simply because they do not spend the bulk of their lives there. So Keller's paradigmatic example of a cosmopolitan citizen is someone who has lived in more than one country and has no patriotic attachment to any of them. But this point applies equally well to someone who has spent her whole life in the same place. Now, if we want to explain why it's preferable to have the kind of attitude towards one's country that Keller is recommended, what Keller does is making the case that patriotism has serious liabilities. Keller defines patriotism as a specific kind of loyalty to country and argues that this loyalty makes patriots particularly liable to self-deception. Patriotic loyalty, as he understands it, is special in the sense that it's non-derivative and non-instrumental, and it expresses an important aspect of someone's identity. So it's not just cheering for the national team in the Soccer World Cup. It is something much stronger, having a very strong identification with the country. And Keller argues that the patriot believes that her country has valuable characteristics that merit her loyalty. So the problem is that when evidence arises that challenges the grounds for her loyalty, the patriot will tend to minimize or dismiss this evidence in order to be able to maintain her loyalty intact. So there is a tendency to make a selective assessment of the qualities of one's country that for Keller is a form of bias or bad faith. So if he's right, there is a systematic risk of self-deception in patriotic attachments precisely because loyalty leads one to avoid facing unpleasant truths about the object of loyalty. Because patriotism is a persistent tendency, and because the resulting false beliefs often lead one actively to support unjust policies, cosmopolitanism can count as a virtue. It corrects a common tendency to form false beliefs about certain political entities, which may sometimes be harmful. And the risk of supporting or committing injustice can be minimized by cultivating a capacity to form a clearer picture of the relevant facts, and cosmopolitanism is this capacity. Now, if we want to make the case that cosmopolitanism is a corrective virtue, it is not necessary to show that patriotism always involves bad faith. It's sufficient to show that there is a very strong correlation. There's a common correlation, and that self-deception in looking at one's country when one is a patriot is very common, and that it is present in versions of patriotism that, because of happy circumstances, do not result in serious forms of injustice. So there may be some patriots who avoid this tendency to self-deception, but because there are very few exceptions, this wouldn't undermine my general argument. All that is necessary for a Footian argument to work is that patriotism tends to generate bad faith and may facilitate injustice. And this is enough to show that this is a tendency that we do want to keep in check. Now, many philosophers and many people, in fact, advocate the cultivation of patriotism because they think it's important to motivate people to act on their country's behalf. But I think that this recommendation ignores the fact that people can have all sorts of motivation to engage in politically beneficial activities. And many of these motivations are quite independent of any deep sense of identification and loyalty to country. For example, religious or philosophical beliefs may motivate them, or a concern to have a better environment for their children. One of Keller's points is that cosmopolitans are in a better position than patriotic citizens to make good judgments about political affairs, how to vote, which policies to support, or when to engage in civil disobedience. And this is because the cosmopolitan is likely to have acquired a more complex set of commitments and identifications, and she's better positioned to have formed a more accurate picture of the country where she lives. And though Keller doesn't make this point, the communities that cosmopolitans work to support or build need not always coincide with the boundaries of a state, a nation, or a culture. But of course, they need not always be international either. Okay, so now let me turn to civic education. So the distinctive feature of my cosmopolitan approach is the corrective nature of it. It will direct our attention to educational interventions that aim to correct common mistaken beliefs and attitudes towards political entities and towards other people perceived as affiliated with these political entities. If I am right that there is a tendency to simplify and distort what political and cultural phenomena are like, to get them wrong, we should keep in mind these epistemic and associated moral liabilities in order to design educational strategies that specifically target them. So as I understand it, cosmopolitan education is not multicultural education. There is an enormous literature in multicultural education, and part of the issue here is that a little bit like cosmopolitanism, maybe even worse, that this literature is grounded in a wide variety of theoretical approaches. So what I would support is forms of multicultural education proposals that encourage students' interaction across cultural differences, because these proposals serve goals that are similar to the ones I would advocate. But despite the partial agreement in policy, there is an important difference between cosmopolitan education and multicultural education, because multicultural education has been primarily thought of as a response to existing forms of cultural pluralism inside a particular country, such as Canada or the United States. And the kind of cosmopolitan civic education that I am advocating will be wider. Multicultural education has as the primary goal the cultivation of intercultural dispositions to equip future citizens with knowledge and skills that will allow them to interact in fair, thoughtful, and respectful ways with others who may not share exactly the same cultural norms, but who do share a set of legal and political institutions, if they are fellow citizens in the same country. Okay. And a cosmopolitan civic education may support interculturalism, and for pedagogical reasons may also recommend starting with the study of local forms of diversity and encourage intercultural skills in a similar way. But a truly cosmopolitan education will ground its recommendations in a wider picture and will have wider concerns. One of the things it will say is that human beings have always been migrating, interacting with foreigners, learning from and developing cross-cultural norms and practices. And because of the nature of cultural phenomena, the cultural affiliation of individuals are properly seen by cosmopolitans as heterogeneous and deriving from different sources. So this way of understanding cultural affiliation doesn't involve denying that there are cultural practices and norms that predominate in a given society, or it doesn't deny also that people's capacities to incorporate and learn new cultural materials vary with age and well as with social and personal circumstances. Another specific feature I think that cosmopolitan education will have is that it will we will try to make students aware of the common tendency to overestimate the impact that political borders have on social and cultural phenomena. We tend to think that if there's a border, then there's different cultures and they're separate, right? And underestimate the connections, interactions, common problems, and mutual dependency of people separated by those borders. So cross-border phenomena may be overlooked if we focus only on the appropriate responses by citizens to the existing forms of cultural pluralism inside their country. Now, of course, as we are aware, the history of encounters between cultures, nations, and countries has not always been peacefully regulated by morally acceptable norms. So part of the point of cosmopolitan education will be to develop capacities to evaluate past and present practices and institutions from an unbiased perspective. So cosmopolitan education will be particularly concerned with ways of correcting the distortions that collective loyalties often produce in our judgments about what justice requires at different levels. So we cannot really summarize the kind of conclusions that cosmopolitans will tend to reach in a set of simple theses, because these appropriate conclusions will depend on contextual matters. But what I'm interested in is that to be able to make sound judgments about the demands of justice, What students need to do is to develop skills necessary for obtaining reliable factual information that is relevant to the issues under consideration. So it will be useful for my purposes, the rigorous study of history, political science, sociology, psychology, to help students develop a sense of the complexity of the political phenomena and the fact that collective identities are constructed. So studying these areas can make students appreciate the existence of reasonable disagreements about how best to interpret causal connections between past events, the causes of current social phenomena, the foreseeable consequences of new policies. So part of the idea is that we wouldn't want to simplify these political phenomena. We have to be able to understand that there is this complexity. But also I'm interested in transmitting the idea that we should be very cautious when we are assessing the functioning of political institutions when we are personally connected with them or if we are not very well disposed towards them. Because these are precisely the situations in which we are more likely to make mistaken political judgments. I could give a lot of examples, but I don't want to take too much time. And about this point, both Simon Callan and Harry Brighouse have written on the risks that a patriotic civic education poses. And I want to present very briefly some of their points because I think they can be used for the case of a cosmopolitan education. Callan argues against certain form of patriotic civic education that he calls sentimental. And these are types of civic education that encourages students to believe in very simplified fictions about their country that are really more comforting than the actual facts. And what he's worried about is that a sentimental education will result in forms of self-deception, that is a tendency to filter very complex political events to maintain a belief in very bland and uplifting stories, to continue believing, my country is great and we're doing things always right. But Callan is optimistic about the prospects of schools cultivating benign forms of patriotism that do not hide or distort the truth. In contrast, Harry here is less optimistic than that cultivating patriotism can result in forms of loyalty that are really shaped by a commitment to justice. That is what Imon will recommend. So what he points out is that actual forms of patriotic education generally fall on the sentimental side, and they increase the risks of injustice. Official stories and school textbooks often focus on men, and more recently, 1 or 2 women, who did great things and were apparently inspired by patriotic love to their country and people. But even if these stories are accurate, which I have my doubts, they still constitute a very highly selective and distorted presentation of the facts. At most, because there are revisionist pressures, there is the admission that they may have had some moral weaknesses. But people who cause significant harm or help views that today we find deeply objectionable are not really described as patriots, even though they would have described themselves in that way. So who we want to count as patriot is already pretty selective. So there is these selective processes of public encouragement and reinforcement of patriotism that tends to omit the darker side. And patriotic feelings are too often manipulated for the sake of unjust or worthless causes. So given the tendency of patriotic civic education to take an undesirable shape, I tend to agree with Harry that it's better not to teach patriotism at schools. Now, however, it seems unavoidable to me that most people will develop feelings of attachment and loyalty to collective entities like their country or their nation anyway, even if these feelings are not cultivated at schools. This is true at least if we assume that these collectives treat their members minimally well. If we're treated really awful in our country, probably we're not going to be very patriotic. But so I don't think that eliminating patriotic education is the optimal solution. Rather than suppressing existing collective loyalties, the form of cosmopolitan civic education that my Futian view of virtue proposes will say we should try to make students aware of the liabilities of these loyalties. That perhaps is the best way to keep them in check. Okay.
Thank you very much. Well, I thank both of both of our speakers, and I mean, I have plenty of questions, but if the moment comes when I can use the privilege of the chair to sneak in, I will do so. But I think it's best if we open up questions to the floor and have the speakers engage directly with your concerns. Yeah. Oh, and if you could please identify yourself so that they can give you proper attribution in their books.
Thanks. So I'm Caleb Young. I'm a postdoc at McGill. So my question is for Harry, and it's about this idea of the establishment clause, or kind of, and your sort of skepticism about establishment clause, formal separation of church and state. I wonder if behind that skepticism is a conception of maybe liberal neutrality that you have. So to me, it looks like you're appealing to some idea of liberal neutrality as like neutrality of justification or something like this, and you think that maybe case law in the U.S. takes it as neutrality of effect, because you said something like, well, it would be irrational to forego policies that foreseeably are going to produce some public good, just because they would also end up promoting certain types of religious conceptions or something. So that seemed to be your main reason why you found the establishment clause kind of problematic. And I wonder if that behind that is a view of liberal neutrality that takes neutrality of justification rather than effect to be the sort of correct understanding of liberal neutrality. Thanks.
So I was too mean about the establishment clause. What I'm perfectly happy for there not to be an established church in the US. I would oppose the disestablishment of the Church of England in the UK. What I'm really unhappy with is the way that the establishment clause is understood in constitutional law, which it just seems to come out of nowhere to me. And case law has added up to a sort of set of practices that are permitted and not permitted that make no sense at all. It's just not possible to come up with a principle that would give them that would support that. I guess I'm not. I don't think the state has to be neutral in effect or in intent. I'm sort of sufficient. I mean, it's hard to square my willingness to sort of entertain a kind of liberal perfectionism with my nevertheless quite strong demand that people, when they call upon the government to act, use values that can be widely shared. But I think I can square them. But I don't think the state has to be neutral.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Frederick Armstrong. I'm a PhD at McGill in philosophy. I'm wondering if you could put back the slide on competent citizenship on. Because it seems to me that you're opposing competent citizenship and, I guess, whatever you could learn from a faith school. But as far as I know, most religions advocate something like competent citizenship insofar as you are dealing with members of your own faith. So being a good Catholic is being nice to other Catholics, and being a good Muslim is being nice to other Muslims. And what do you say to people who would say, because it seems that funding Catholic schools in a majority, in a country where the majority of people are broadly Christians, whether they be secular or actually practice Christianity, it's not so much a problem because we don't really question the loyalty that these people would learn in a Catholic school, just because most interactions they would have with others, co-citizens, they could assume that they're also Catholics, so they would be nice to them. So what do you say to people who say, well, we shouldn't fund Muslim schools in Western countries because we're not really sure about where their loyalty lies?
Yeah, so that by the way, is, you know, in the letter on toleration, Locke says exactly that about Catholics. Like, we can't, you know, you should tolerate everybody except Catholics because they are loyal to the Pope, and atheists because you can't trust them anyway.
He changed his mind about atheists, I think, near the end
Oh, did he?
of his life.
Oh, at the end of his life.
Not the end of his life.
No. I just think, what did I miss?
Yeah, no.
Say also something, don't tolerate Jews too.
Huh?
Didn't he say that too, Locke?
Yeah, Jews
Yeah.
as well. Yeah. Basically, we should tolerate Protestants, which
Right.
is, you know, I'm in favour of tolerating Protestants too. So the institutional approach that I, you know, sort of very briefly says, well, let's suppose the worst, or nearly the worst, about Muslim schools, right? I mean, let's suppose that they're really quite bad at promoting citizenship in this way. Still, there are going to be reasons to fund them, right? And there are going to be, so in the UK, you know, one of the reasons is it's just unconscionable to go around destroying people's cultures and, you know, stealing everything from them. And then when, you know, some people from those cultures come to your country, say, oh yeah, we've been funding religious schools, but we're going to stop now because you've come here, right? So, but the other reason is the kind of reason I gave, right? So I don't think Muslims on average are more distrustable than any than any other sort of group. But suppose they were, still, the reasons to fund them are to fund those kinds of schools selectively, as I think we should fund Catholic and Protestant schools as well, have to do with the consequences of not funding them. Right, that's all. Yeah.
Okay, so it's basically a second best sort of argument.
Yeah. It's all second best. I mean, you know, so maybe you should sort of think of my best argument is, I don't really believe this, but, you know, the best argument is don't have great secular schools that are just fantastic at everything and then don't fund the religious schools and whatever. That would be, but that's a silly, counterfactual. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your speech. And I missed the first part. Sorry. I'm Hisham, a PhD at UCAM, and I'm working on Islamic schools, citizenship and identity construction. That's the topic. I think when we approach Islamic schools or faith schools in general, we take or we erase from the picture public schools. I'm doing my field work right now, and in all conversations or interviews with my participants, they mention the public system. They are not just running towards the faith school or the Islamic school just out of love, but they are running away from the public system. Yeah. So for all sorts of reasons, some of those reasons are not religious at all. So there are religious reasons, but other reasons are a safer environment and all of that. So my question is how, I'm looking at whether these schools promote citizenship or not. How do we check that? Most Islamic schools do not have a regular Islamic school curriculum that you can just go and look at.
Yeah.
So is it just based on interviews? So that's what I'm doing now. So I'm just checking, I'm looking whether graduates from Islamic schools vote, or what do they think about equality, tolerance, civic participation, democracy, and all of that. But if we build our judgment on that, is it fair? So especially if we look at graduates of public schools, we might find just in the mainstream society others who attended regular schools who do not believe in democracy, who do not vote, and all of that.
Oh, goodness. So, one of the problems is that political scientists do not have measures of good citizenship. They have measures of things like the extent to which people vote. Well, lots of people shouldn't vote. Like, lots of people, if they're good citizens, won't vote. Right? And I'll just give you, a little example I a group of students who I was teaching around the time of the 2012 election. And I asked them, a small group of students, I knew them very well, and I said, so how many of you are voting? And like 2 of them, yeah, we're voting. And all the others said they weren't going to vote. And I said, why? And all of them, and they're great kids, they all said, well, we don't know enough. Like, voting is a serious matter. Do you understand that? They say to me. And we don't feel like we know enough to vote. We can't just sort of go out there. And what political scientists have tended to do is they've tended to treat participation of whatever kind as a measure of citizenship. It is not. For a lot of good citizenship is not participating. It's not going to the wrong kind of demonstration, right? It's not voting for the wrong party, or it's not voting when you have no idea what on earth you're doing. And so that puts you in just an incredibly difficult situation, right? Because the people you're relying on have not developed good measures of what you want to measure. I really recommend that you read The Political Classroom, the book that was on the slide. Because it's behind me, I can't sort of reliably get to it, but just stop me when I get there, and I'll. Because they also don't have good measures of high quality citizenship, but they're very detailed interview data. They're very where are we? There we are. They're very detailed interview data. They're very detailed interviews, both of selected teachers, and they've got classroom observation of selected teachers, so you can read the scripts, and ongoing surveys and interviews of the students, finding out both about what they think about what happened in the classroom and about their attitudes. And I think it has to be attitudinal what you want to look at. Now, they had a study that took them 7 years, I think, right? And they managed to get funding for it over time. So that's hard to do. But I would look for qualitative rather than quantitative stuff. And of course, you need a comparison class.
And will you attribute the attitude to the Islamic or the faith school in general?
So there are no Islamic schools in their study. I would say that my read of their study, and they're not here, so they can't say anything about it. I would say there's no difference. There's very high quality stuff going on in religious schools, including in very conservative evangelical Protestant schools. There's very high quality stuff going on in some large public schools. There's very low quality stuff going on in some religious schools. They don't make that judgment, but you will when you read the book. And very low quality stuff going on in some public schools. And you wouldn't know which to, you wouldn't, knowing, if you wanted your kid to be a good citizen in the way that I understand good citizenship, and my guess is you do, you wouldn't know from whether the school is religious or not, whether you should send your kid to it. Frankly, I'd be surprised if Islamic schools are different. I'd be surprised if Islamic schools, except for those schools, and there are Christian schools like this too, which are really dedicated to creating a kind of an elite of believers. I'd be surprised that if on average they're significantly different from other kinds of schools, or at least significantly worse or better. They might be different, and that's what you should be sort of trying to find out, I guess.
Thanks.
In front of you. Yes, you. There.
Hi, Sarah Stroud from McGill.
I think it's recording.
It was on? Okay.
Yeah, it seems off.
I apologize. I also have a question for Harry. Victoria,
I have a
sorry
question for
about
Victoria
this,
right after.
But it's hard to go up against faith schools. Harry, I wanted to ask a question about a dialectical move that came up once or twice in the paper that I have no firm opinion about, but it struck me as possibly dodgy. And it also struck me that a lot was riding on it. So I just wanted to bring it up, and I have a kind of analogy that may or may not help us decide whether it's dodgy. So there were a couple of places where you brought up the really interesting issue of what's the appropriate comparison class for schools. So this came up when you were talking about the reasons to think that in general faith schools might have a problem with developing competent citizens. And then it came up again when you were talking about the school-based approach. And both times you said, well, we shouldn't compare these schools, whether sort of collectively or individually, with some ideal. We should compare them with what are the actual competitors or the other possibilities that are out there. Yeah. So, I mean, I'll just quickly rehearse why Lott was riding on that, right? Because if you compare a school with an ideal, that's a very demanding standard, and so it's quite likely, or much more likely, that any given school is going to fail that comparison, right? Whereas if you compare a school with the crappy other stuff that's out there, right, that might be a very undemanding test, and so the school is much more likely to pass it. Okay. So in other words, it really makes a difference to your argument, I think, that we accept that the relevant comparison class is, you know, whatever else is out there or whatever these kids would otherwise be doing, rather than comparing it with sort of our Platonic ideal of a liberal education. Okay. So as I said, I have no firm opinion about this. I'm not convinced that it's wrong, but it struck me as disputable whether that's the proper comparison class. And then I thought actually of an analogy, interestingly, that has to do with parenting. And I don't know whether, I just offer this up, I don't know whether this helps or hurts your use of this strategy in this case. So a common complaint that would-be adoptive parents make is that in order to be allowed to adopt, they're visited by all of these, you know, inquisitive social workers and, you know, asked a million questions about all sorts of things about the home they would be providing, their marriage, their financial prospect, you know, and that they have to really go through a whole giant inquisition in order to be given permission to adopt this child. And I think that, I mean, I've heard people who either have adopted or want to adopt a child express a lot of frustration with this because they feel that they're being compared with an ideal. Yeah. Whereas, you know, they'll often add, you know, plenty of the biological parents out there that don't have to go through this are, you know, way, way worse parents than, you know, what the bar that we had to meet in order to be accepted as adoptive parents. I think they think that that's quite unfair. That, you know, they're being compared with an ideal, because if they were just being compared with the other parents that are out there, that's a very undemanding standard, and so they, you know, they would for sure they would pass. Yeah. So as I say, I don't know if that analogy helps or hurts you. I just wanted to invite you, I guess, to say a little bit more about this important move.
Yeah, so some people hate it when I do this, not so much with respect to religious schools, but when I do it with respect to sort of other kinds of policy choices which people are making, right? Because people, you know, how can you, so you say that, you know, they have to judge a charter school against the other kind of school that kids might go to. Come on, you've got to have stronger standards than that. When you're making, I mean, so the perspective is different. So I spend a lot of time thinking about what actual decision makers who are sitting here right now should do, the choice they should make, given all of the normative considerations, right? And I think when you're thinking about that, you should be comparing with what the other real alternative is. And that the other real alternative isn't exactly the crappy schools that exist. It's the crappy schools that would exist given that you actually have some sort of power to do things about them right now, right? You're running a school board or you're running the Department of Education or whatever. You have some power to do things. I think it's really hard to improve the quality of schooling in any respect in short spaces of time, in the kind of time horizons that most people have. That's one of the reasons I don't think schooling improves a lot. So that's why I make the move the way I do. And I have a lot of sympathy with the adoptive parents, although, you know, it has to be said, adoptive children do quite a lot better on average than children of biological parents. And so, you know, there is something to be said for holding them to this high standard. Maybe we should, you know, maybe they're complaining about the wrong thing, which is that everybody else should be held to this high standard too. But I do if you're not in that position, if you're not thinking about the particular decision maker making that decision right now, and you're thinking about somebody who has much more, much more long-term capacities, then yeah, obviously they're making a different decision. And it might be the case that making this decision here now makes it harder for you to set in place a dynamic or a set of reforms that will improve things more over the long run. And I think that's why people don't like it when I make this move this way. And I think that's true. And so then when I'm thinking about that decision maker, the person who has more long-term sort of macro decision-making power or influence, then I would say different things to that person. Maybe. In this case, I don't think I would. In this case, I think I'd probably still say the same thing.
So I'm going to use the privilege of the chair here because there is an engagement that I had in the notes that I was taking between your two papers. And maybe it just reflects my uneasiness with some framings of cosmopolitanism as a project, even though I consider myself, if anything, something of a cosmopolitan. Certainly, I have no patriotic attachment to the country I came from, and don't tell the people I just swore allegiance to, but no patriotic attachment, strictly speaking, to the countries I'm a citizen of, neither one of which is the one I came from, if you want to get very complicated about it. But it seems to me that the description of cosmopolitan education and what cosmopolitan education is supposed to do as a corrective, as a virtue, undermines the case for faith schools as much as it undermines the case for a patriotic element in public education. When you talk about the kind of questioning that a cosmopolitan education ought to do, which we usually direct at the state, the Republican project of nation building, et cetera. Something like that also happens in faith schools. The description of Roman Catholic schools that you were giving, our schools, if you think of the definition of Jewish identity involved in the Jews Free School case, where one branch of Judaism wanted to hold a very strict halakhic interpretation of who is a Jew, and others of more liberal branches of Judaism wanted to undermine that. And that played out in the courts. You could say that pushing a cosmopolitan education onto religious schools would in fact undermine the same flaws and prejudices that religious education tries to instill, and then cosmopolitanism would undermine the case for faith schools. Does it?
I haven't thought about that, but I think that ideally it's better if people interact. So I have an ideal of a society in which people are willing to talk to each other, that they are not like divided in groups and they live and let live and that's the way it goes. But then the question is, in a particular society, would you want to do that or not? And what are the options that you have?
Mm-hmm. But
I don't think that there's like systematic biases that are taught in religious education. I haven't thought about it in that way, but I do think we tend to get this very rosy picture of the country. Well, it depends what kind of civic education you were exposed to, where the story they tell you, it's just very one-sided and all the nasty parts are out. And then you find out later if you continue studying, but then you get this picture about your country that it's very distorted. And I think that we should try to combat that tendency. And we should be cautious, because we tend to be partial. So I think it's a good idea to know that and to try to step back and say, well, let's try to look at this from another point of view.
I think it's just to just offer you that example. Something like that happens also if we look at the specific religious schools. I'll give you the example. I went to a Jesuit school. I can recognize and hum the theme to The Mission, the movie, The Mission. I'll be able to do so for the rest of my life because they showed us every single movie which I think there's like at least three movies where Jesuits are the heroes. And their goal is, maybe 9 of our 9 out of 10 kids will become atheists, but the 10th one will become a Jesuit, and that's, that's all we want. There was also
about the Inquisition in Latin
no,
America.
but those were the Dominicans, and maybe some of the Franciscans. No. But it's true. It was a one-sided view. It was it was more. It had more sides to it than maybe what I would have gotten in some other setting. I didn't become a Jesuit, so you can figure out the rest. But still, it seems applicable to those situations as well. And I wonder if the presence of a counter-narrative that is not cosmopolitan, like the presence of a religious school as an alternative to a state school, as opposed to the establishment of a cosmopolitan curriculum for all schools, is a different model. And it's not for us to solve the problem now, but there's the problem, there's the model of cosmopolitanism as a virtue, and there's the model, perhaps more pessimistic, more second best, of pluralism as a series of vices that fight against each other and somehow mitigate themselves. But I think it's, I just offer it as other possible models to be compared.
Okay, I have to think about it.
Christianity and Islam are both cosmopolitan religions,
Yes.
right? And that's one of the again, if the secular schools are offering the kind of cosmopolitan education that Victoria, and she's outed me as agreeing with her, would like to see, then that's one thing. But if they're offering, I actually went to secular schools, and they were, we were taught to be patriotic, and it was they remarkably failed, but and that was what we were taught. And if I'd gone to a Muslim school or a Catholic school, not a Church of England school, I would have been taught there are, you have fellow believers. You're part of a community which is really an international community and that we would like to be more international. We'd like it, and so it's it could be a countervailing force, and maybe that's what you're thinking about in thinking about this sort of pluralism, where all these different things are. Well, you said fighting it out, but countervailing one another. So it might be. I like Islam and Christianity. I'm an atheist, but I like them exactly because they're cosmopolitan in the way that I think is good. Sorry, I shouldn't say things.
All right. Well, we have reached the. We did start a little bit late, but I think that given the obligations that I'm sure all of us have, familial, religious, educational, etc., we'll end it here. I want to thank again our panelists. I think this was a very interesting and thought-provoking panel, and especially our organizers, who did such a wonderful job, not only with this panel, but with the entire series, and I think they deserve an applause.